next Thursday we can log in from home?
Yeah, anybody can. So, hi everybody, welcome to camera class today. My name is Saxon, I'm your host, and today we're going to be doing advanced cameras. I did actually just have a student who asked about the logging in process, and yeah, no, if you want, what you can do is right now anybody who's watching this is on YouTube at the current moment. So if you go to YouTube, type in Apt Electronics, you'll get a notification if you subscribe to that YouTube channel as soon as I go live. So every Thursday, 5:30, I log on, and then I usually have it going from 5:30 till 6:30. The last 30 minutes, I tell people they can chat, ask questions. You guys ask questions. I keep the video going so people can hear the questions being asked. Then we go from there. So yeah, if you're further away or anything else, and the same thing, if you're online and it's easier for you to come in or you'd rather get the experience coming in person, by all means, whatever's easiest for you. But we offer both. All right, we'll jump into it. Let me move this over so you guys can see the major screen. But today's focus is going to be advanced cameras. So kind of going in advanced cameras, really the idea with this is now to get your content creation off the ground. You're somebody who is experienced with your camera, you understand the basics for taking photos and everything else. You might just need more practice or more experience with it. But now you're wondering what's the next step. Maybe you want to start doing YouTube, or maybe you want to start putting your pictures somewhere else. What do you do after you're done shooting? And that's what we're going to be covering today. So, getting into the first slide here. First thing I like to talk about in the advanced section is JPEG or RAW. Now, for most of the classes that we've been talking about, and most times I tell people, or most times I'm talking about cameras, we talk about shooting in JPEG. And I like shooting in JPEG because it's simple, you get the picture that you want, and you're done. You don't have to really do anything with it, but you can if you'd like to. Most JPEGs will give you the ability to edit. And when I say most, I mean all JPEGs give you the ability to edit. However, the gambit or the area of which you're able to edit changes. So when we look at pictures, images have a certain color bit or color, what's the term I'm looking for? Color spectrum or editing spectrum that they're in. When we look at a JPEG image, which is in our direct center here, we have the same image just 3 times over in different styles. We can see that the JPEG, you can see all the colors, everything looks right on the image. It looks just like a standard photo would look. When we look next to the RAW, we notice that it's more washed out. There's really not as much vibrancy to it. It almost blends in with the background in a sense. But then when we look to the right of the JPEG, we see a processed RAW. And the processed RAW looks pretty similar to the JPEG, except the processed RAW looks a little sharper. The wrinkles in his shirt are more clear. The guitar strap has more of an auburn color to it. Even the guitar, there's a kind of a red that goes, or the bass I should say, I think it's a bass. Yeah, it's a bass. There's like a red hue that goes around the brown part of the guitar. In the JPEG, it almost feels like it's washed off, or maybe it's just something from the sun. But on the right image, you can see it's much more apparent or vibrant. The idea is that a JPEG image should come out of the camera finalized. The JPEG is a compressed file, meaning that the camera used its ability, it used its software to get you the final image. The RAW, on the other hand, doesn't process the image for you. It doesn't compress the image for you. It keeps the file open. By doing that, you now have more access to the full color of the image, to the sharpness, to the quality of the image, so you can start accentuating or decentuating certain qualities of it, and that's where you see the processed RAW. It takes everything that the JPEG basically is, but makes it better. Some people don't want to shoot in RAW, and that's always up to the shooter. The differences between them, and now I've kind of got this slide to really go through it. A JPEG file, it's a compressed file. It's a smaller sized file. By that I mean it's 2 to 6 megabytes in size, so it's relatively takes up no storage. You can get thousands and thousands of JPEGs on a 64 gigabyte SD card before you run out of storage. Oops.
Oh, go there.
That guy just kind of went out. So, JPEG, now you've got a smaller file size, but now what I was talking about before is a lower color bit. So that color bit is important. Now, to really break down the color bit, kind of like taking your hands and going like this. Let's pretend that a JPEG has about this much color in between itself. You have that much to play with. When you go to a RAW, you've now got double to triple that amount. In this sense, depending on what you're looking at, you're either looking at an 8-bit color, which would be low. On the RAW files, it's anywhere between 12 and 16, depending. So it's more to play with, more that you can edit. A JPEG can be still edited, but you're limited. And if you go on to, like, let's say Photoshop or Lightroom, or even the free ones, like the Windows computers will have their own free version, Mac is going to have their own free version. You'll see if you try to play with some of those dials on there, they're not going to give you too much. You might notice that the saturation goes up or goes down, or maybe the sharpness goes up a little bit or goes down a little bit. But as far as what you're changing on the image, you might not be able to change a whole lot. The other benefit to a JPEG is that it's transferred faster. So it doesn't take a long time to transfer a JPEG. Now, there are caveats to this. What you're experiencing yourself having a larger camera that has a larger megapixel sensor, you're going to notice that images take a little bit longer to transfer onto the computer. That's normal. Switching from a cable to the camera, from an SD card to the computer, it really won't maybe change the speed at which it transfers. They're all going to transfer relatively the same. The only thing you can maybe do is get a faster SD card. That's typically what people will get, something with a faster write speed. Because the read speed is what it's reading it at on the camera. The write speed is also what helps it not only write onto the physical camera, but then send in and write onto a computer, if you will. When we look at RAW, it's an uncompressed file, which basically means it's a larger file size. So in this case, now you're jumping almost double the size, if not double, what a standard JPEG is. So RAW, 12 to 16 megabytes. Now you're looking at taking 3 times to 4 times less photos than you would if you were shooting on JPEG. The benefit, though, is that now you have much more to play with and to edit as far as color goes. So it's got a higher color bit rate. So now we're looking at a 12-bit or a 16-bit. You can edit a RAW photo on most editing, or I should say some editing softwares, but most likely it's going to be needed to be converted into another file. This was a downside to RAW years ago. A lot of editing programs couldn't handle the size that RAW was at. Photoshop, Lightroom, I'm almost positive Corel Pro, and there's one more that I can't think of right now. They're all going to let you play with a RAW file nowadays. So for majority of most editing softwares, you can edit a RAW, you can edit a JPEG. Playing with a RAW file is going to have much more room to play with, giving you as the photographer more to play with, to edit, to change. So you have the ability more so with RAW than you do with JPEG. Now, on the flip side of this, if you are not interested in editing your photos whatsoever, number one, the class I'm teaching right now probably isn't the best for you. But number two, you probably have no reason to shoot on RAW then, and I would recommend shooting on JPEG. When we look at the images on the other side, there really isn't too much of a difference between the JPEG and the processed RAW. When you stare at them and you see the coloration and the vibrancy on the processed RAW, that's really what stands out against the JPEG. Now, if you don't care at all about that, that's not something that's interesting to you, then I would stick with JPEG. You'll save yourself the file size on your SD card, giving you more images that you can take on one shoot. But then at the same time too, you're going to get an image that is already taken care of for you, it's done, and if there are maybe some slight changes in the future you want to make to it, you can still do that. So my recommendation is shoot on RAW if that's something that you feel comfortable with and something that you are actually looking into exploring of changing and editing your photos. But if that's not something that you want to do, JPEG is going to be just fine. No one's going to give you a hard time for shooting JPEG. But now that we've covered on how to make the camera take the photo, In my last classes, we really focused on shooting. The intro to cameras was mainly automatic, how to shoot through the frame and worry about composition. Intermediate cameras, we break down f-stop, we broke down shutter, and we broke down ISO. We talked about how all three work separately and then how they all come together for that manual control of the camera. But now, we've taken the photos, we've done everything that we can. What do we do next? We're going to edit our photos. So the next couple slides, these are going to be the editing processes that you're going to see across every editor that you get, whether it's free or advanced. Every editor is going to have something different on there after these things. So those are things you'll have to learn either on your own, through other videos, maybe something site-specific towards your editor. But no matter what you do, no matter what editor you change from, how many years go by, these are what you're going to see consistently throughout. This has been just about since the first Photoshop until about now. So to start off, these are some of the editors that I would recommend. Obviously, Photoshop and Lightroom are the two big boys. Photoshop's been around the longest. The way I describe this to people is I like to think of Photoshop as your big editor. It's got all of the major features on there that you see professionals using nowadays as far as, let's say, complete image distortion or changing. If you want to change your background and make it a starry background versus, the regular sky, Photoshop's your person. If you want to do the new generative AI tool where you can select parts of the image and let Photoshop change it or do something for you, that's Photoshop. That's going to be the more big controls. If you've got, let's say, 200 photos, you are at a wedding, you want to change the color, you want to make it just look very vibrant, very popish, that's where Lightroom is better for that. Lightroom lets you bring in hundreds of images at one time. You can edit one image and save those settings as a preset, and then you can actually move those presets over and change a bunch of images at once. As far as then transferring images, it makes it a lot easier. Photoshop is really for one image at a time. Lightroom is, I would say, for multitudes, and it doesn't necessarily have all of the generative changing features that Photoshop has. Lightroom is more for the light, for the color, for the dodging and burning. It's more of those simple changes based on the color, not so much the integrity of the photo. Capture One Pro and Corel Paint Shop Pro are both two great features as well too. Corel Paint Shop Pro, it's more going to be like Photoshop where you get the big changes on there that you can play with. And Capture One Pro kind of combines the best of both worlds between Lightroom and Photoshop. But I would say they're very similar. From what I understand with Capture One and Corel, you only pay one time. Whereas Adobe nowadays makes it where it's a monthly membership. And that's because they're constantly updating and adding stuff, and then Adobe gives you a few other things too. But that's kind of the gist of those. So why do we edit the photos? Maybe let's talk about that first. I like to use these examples. In a lot of the cases with our photos, we might have gotten everything perfect on the first try. Our image might look great. But there might be some things on the image that we just don't like. It could be the shadows. When we look at the image in the top left corner, the way that the gentleman is leaning over next to the girl, it kind of gives him more darkness on his shirt, on his skin, on his clothing. And so by just going through and editing it slightly, we can make things pop a little bit more, bring more vibrancy to the image, which helps both the subject matters. On the right side, we have a nice landscape there, but when we look at the grass, it's very dark. The clouds bring in a slight overcast, so we don't necessarily have the vibrancy from the green and the water that we should. Just by changing some things up slightly, now you look on the right side of that photo, same thing, it just kind of has more of a pop to it. The infant photo that we have in the bottom, you got the wrinkles, there's a little bit more of a roughness to the skin. They smooth it out in the next one, and it helps. Brings out more of the light qualities of the newborn. And then you've got three of the same images. Not a single one looks bad on there, but you can see what gets changed as they were edited. Her skin looks a little bit lighter. It's more vibrant. Her hair stands out more. The blue of her shirt is more popish. And then the background too. There's more light. There's more color on the greenery. Even though the background's blurred, there's still some extra oomph to it to help bring more attention to the subject matter. So why do we edit our photos? Because it matters. Because color, because everything. When people look at this, people want to see the best qualities of the photo brought forward. So the first thing I tell people when you're editing your photo, the first thing you should be doing is cleaning and cropping your image. So start by straightening the alignment of your photo. After that, go through and make sure you do not have any excess negative or dead space. And spot cleaning should occur at this time too. So, for example, you're going to see this icon on your editing software. For those looking on the screen or online, it's the square with a line going through it, but usually it's a dotted line. This typically on most editing softwares is your crop and is also your straightener, where it can change the alignment of the photo. Typically, you'll also see some area for spot clean too on there as well. Now, when we talk about spot cleaning, it might not be anything too crazy, but sometimes on our camera we might have dust on our sensor. We might have things that look dirty. If anybody remembers back in the day of film, you would stand in the enlarger and you would take paddles and you would kind of move around to dodge and burn. The dodging and burning would help get rid of those imperfections that showed up on the film. This in itself is the same thing, you're just doing it digitally now. So no more dodging and burning with paddles and whatnot, now you're doing it on the computer. Same thing with a 35mm film. When you enlarge an image, you would sit there on the enlarger and make sure you got it perfectly before you pulled your film out to expose your film, or to expose your paper. Same idea with this one. Except now what you're doing is you're looking at the image and you're seeing, is there any negative space or any dead space that doesn't benefit my image? If so, let me crop in on my subject matter and bring it out. So in this case, the person who's taking this photo was taking a shot from behind their subject. They didn't really like the mountain or the beach on the right side there. They were focused on the water and maybe the serenity of that. So they cropped in on that guy, brought it in further to bring that stuff out. Same idea too. Maybe in the sky up here we could have some burn marks or some marks that didn't look right. Using the spot cleaning tool, we can take a clean part of the sky, match it, and then it will help us change everything. Nowadays too, with the generative AI that Photoshop and Adobe's been making, there's a lot more that we don't need to necessarily splice a color from a different section of the image. We can just click on the part that's more harsh, and the AI processor will just take it away for us.
Well,
it's really incredible what some of these photo editors can do for you without you really having to do too much. But this is the first thing that I like to do. So we are changing the alignment, we're cropping in, and we're getting rid of any imperfections on the image that could negatively impact us. The next thing I like to do is adjust my white balance. White balance does not refer to exposure. Rather, it refers to the color of your overall composition. You will have less to play with when shooting in standard JPEG versus RAW, and some editors will have presets you can control and change. Others are going to have temperature and tint. So, for example, on some of these guys you're going to see this, where it's not necessarily going to look exactly like this, but there might be a drop-down menu where it'll say things like tungsten, fluorescent, flash, cloudy, shade, gaslight. Those are different terminologies for lighting structures that would affect the balance of whites on your physical image. So the camera or the editor is basically looking at the photo and it says, okay, here's the whitest point. We're going to say that water that's crashing on the wave. How can we take that whitest point and change everything else on the image without really negatively impacting that, but while keeping that the brightest point? That's what really the white balance is doing. It's taking the white of your image and balancing it with the rest, or unbalancing it depending on what you want. And that's what you're going to see across the board on this, with those presets. Certain ones, and for example, now this is actually on the video editor from Adobe. This is from Premiere Pro. But Premiere Pro also uses the same editing features that your regular Photoshop or Lightroom would use. On the white balance selector, you've got temperature and tint. Now, there's 4 different colors. There's a couple different ways that people register color. There's RGB, and then there's CMYK. RGB is a 3-way color system or a 3-scale color system, and CMYK is a 4-scale color system. When we're looking at this, it's at a 4-scale color system. You basically have your cyan on one side, and then your Yellow would be the other one because you got CY and KI. So you got cyan and yellow, and that's going to be your blue, and then your kind of orangish yellowish color. And then you have your magenta, I can't think of what the K stands for. That's slipping my mind. Anyway, your tint would be your other two. So M, magenta, that would be your purplish color, and then K would be more for green. I can't think off the top of my head what green stands for. But basically, or what the K stands for. Basically, you're moving these back and forth, and it's going to adjust the color the same way that it is doing there. So it depends on which editing software that you have. Some will have presets, some will just have temperature and tint, some will have both. But my recommendation to you with both is to play with them. No matter what setting we're talking about on here, the best way to learn about how your image is going to be affected, and it sounds silly, but take that dial and push it all the way one direction, and then pull it back. See how the image changes overall. When we look at things like sharpness, or when we look at the temperature and tint, you'll notice right away when you bring something all the way in one direction, it'll turn green, or this will get dull, or the color will look different right there. That's what you're looking for, and that's what's going to help educate you on how you need to change things. Most of these changes that we're making when we're editing are going to be small. You're not going to be changing things 20 points in one direction. You might change it 0.02 of whatever it is. It might be something so small, but those details are what matter at the end of the day, and that's what matters to the photographer, matters to the editor of those photos. The next thing after we've played with our white balance will now be our exposure and contrast. The two are different, but they're going to be in the same category, if you will. So exposure plays on the brightness and darkness of a photo. Beware of making a photo too bright, because it can start to get muted or muddled look to your photo. Contrast plays with the dark and the light tones. High contrast makes the image stark with a very dark and very light sections. Low contrast will make things look flat and washed out. The goal is to aim for something in the middle. So we'll start with exposure. Exposure plays with the brightness of your entire image. So it's not just looking at one thing. It's looking at the entirety of the image. So an example of what we can look at when we talk about exposure. This is a great example here. Underexposed, normal, and over. If you were to shoot an image, let's say you're walking home and you got a nice walkway leading into your condo, or you're on vacation and you got the resort in the background, and you're taking a photo, you're focused on the entire image of that area. You probably want to try to get the building, the greenery, all the shades and different stuff that's going on. Maybe there's a beautiful sunset or skyline going on, what have you. So you're just trying to get a clean image. If you play with that exposure compensation on your camera, you might notice that it starts to become dark. And then if you play with it in the opposite direction, you'll notice that it becomes too high. You can change your exposure compensation at any time, and that's the fun part about the camera. While you're shooting, you can up or lower the exposure compensation. Same thing on the computer, you can up or lower the exposure compensation. Typically, you are aiming to get something in the middle. So in this case, if you took this photo like this in maybe real life, you got home, you're like, oh, this is too dark, it's not what I wanted. You look at the camera settings, you're like, okay, my exposure compensation was set to -2. What do I do? You can change that, because it's just the exposure compensation that you're trying to change. So if you bring that into an editor, you should be able to bring that up to normal from the camera, and it won't probably show that it's at -2 on your physical editor. Probably show it's at 0, but then from there you would then bump it up to maybe be +2. From there, that should then make your image go from this going back to this image. On the flip side, when we talk about contrast, now we're talking about dark and light tones within the image. So now we're not looking at the whole image. If we were to sit there and take maybe, I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it. If you were to plug this into the computer and tell whatever it is, some program, find me the darkest points of this image, it would mute out everything here, and you would only see those dark shadows of the mountain points, right? You wouldn't see, the snow, or you wouldn't see this, or you probably wouldn't even see this, because it's not the truest, darkest point. So on the flip side, the light tones, you're not going to see, if you were to have that computer do the rest there, you wouldn't get the midtones that are coming out in the rest of this. You wouldn't get any of that stuff. It would only look for the light tones. So when you're playing with contrast, that's what contrast is doing. Contrast avoids the rest of the image, and it takes your light and your dark tones and either brings them up or brings them down, depending on what you choose them to be. So when we look at the before, we can see that we have the mountain, but it feels a little bit muted. There's not a lot going on, but it's a beautiful shot. When we then change it to the after, we can see how much lighter our light tones have become. They're more standoutish. The dark tones have really fallen in a little bit more. Now they don't necessarily kind of fall stagnant. They actually enhance everything else to make it look darker. And you add a little bit more drama even to the clouds too, because naturally as things start to get darker, the clouds will start to get darker too. So contrast really helps with taking a photo from being maybe something muted or maybe on a happier note, and it can bring darker or lighter tones to it depending on which way you bring it in the spectrum. Now combining the two together, we've got kind of the image in the center here, where you can see how washed out this side looks. The sun looks really good, so you can tell there was a lot of light coming through, but it feels dark. Why does it feel dark? Because it's a little underexposed. So we want to make sure we change that and bring it more to the normal exposure. On top of that, though, we've got a lot of different contrast. We got a lot of contrast going on, because you do have points of here where the sun looks good, light where the rock is hitting, or light on the rocks which is hitting in certain spots. You'll get light shine there, light shine there. So moving it over here, the main goal of the contrast would be to get these dark points to stick out a little bit more on the bottom part there. That kind of reddish rock material that we have going on becomes more present because we've changed the contrast and we've changed our exposure to be a little bit lighter, but then to also allow for the rest of this detail to show. Even in the sky, you can see how much more blue and apparent the clouds are. So playing with those two things as well too will help bring certain attributes on the photo out. They can either add a little bit more dramatization to the photo or to the image, or it could just bring more light to the image, which could help our overall picture look more viewable. Next thing to talk about, and it goes pretty hand in hand with your exposure and contrast, is the idea of a histogram. Now, what is a histogram and how do you use it? A histogram isn't always needed when editing photos. It's also not always needed when you're shooting photos. But it's a really nice way to see how light is being distributed throughout your entire image. So when we look at this, this would be a nice example of a, let's say, a standard, or what a perfect histogram, in a sense, should look like. Maybe it's a little over-exaggerated. I have other images to show after this. But basically, you have a zone that's at the edge for your shadows. You have a zone on the edge for your highlights, and then you have everything else in the middle. So when you're looking at a subject, or for whatever it is that you're taking a photo of, if you click through your display options on your camera, you'll get one where a histogram will pop up in the bottom right corner. This is a way for people to look at their images while they're shooting to see the even distribution of light throughout the whole image. So on one end, you should have shadows, like I was saying, light, the midtones. The idea is that you never want your shadows to be all the way up and everything to be down low. It would look uneven, and the image itself would be darker than it would be light. On the flip side, though, you don't want your lights or your highlights to be all the way up here. Everything else then slopes down, and now you have a washed out image that you just can't really see anything on because it's too light. Same thing with midtones, though. You don't want midtones to be all the way by themselves at the top with nobody else around, because then all you're going to have is a middle ground photo with no light points, no dark points. Now, I've typically never seen anything quite like that. The only reason being is that when you shoot an image, there has to be, unless you're shooting in pitch black and the camera can't pick up anything, even then I think the shadows would be even higher because there really wouldn't be a midtone. You've only have the darkest of the darks. Typically, I don't think I've ever seen a perfect pyramid where it's only midtones and no highlights or shadows. But this is typical for what you'll see. Now, do you need to use one of these? Not necessarily. The images I'm going to show will kind of break that down. So, on the next slide here, these are some of the examples that I have. This is what I refer to when I talk about properly exposed. So we're not far off of what we were just looking at on the other slide. If you keep an eye on that middle one there, the beach picture, and then you look at what we were just looking at, they're pretty identical, right? Your highlights and your shadows have kind of a middle point to them. They kind of almost match each other, and your midtones are your highest one. In that image, you can see that your light and your dark match a little bit better than the other one do, except you will notice that your highlights are a little bit higher. As far as your midtones go, though, you're at a pretty good point. Everything's pretty even on there. And you can even see that within the image. When we look at something that has too much light on one side or overexposed, you're going to notice that everything's crawled up in the right side there, and there's nothing on the left. So from there are no dark points. Anything that's dark is washed out for the most part. That's probably your darkest points where your tree bark are or where your black windows are, but they look muted because they're surrounded by a sky that gets washed out, that blends into the building. You can't even see your horizon line, and you don't even know that that's sand, it just looks white. On the flip side of the underexposed image, now you have nothing sitting on your light side. Everything is concentrated to your midtones and your dark. So what that's basically telling you is that you don't have any balance between the image. Where those areas of white were are now basically gone. They've blended into the midtone categories. Your darkest points now have become overly saturated, and now you're having two highest spikes in the black category. So again, it's not necessarily going to be the same for every image that you take, but this is a general kind of guideline of what you'll see. Now, where the histogram doesn't matter is when you get to stuff like this. If you're doing things that are artistically done for whatever reason, you don't need to pay attention to the histogram because it might not make sense. For example, this hyper close-up photo we have of the dandelion. It's very on the light or overexposed side. But when you look at the image, you can see that there's a very minimal amount of dark. It's almost non-existent. And that's going to be in the center here. That's where we're looking at in the middle. But all of the white that we have on the image looks fine with the context of the image that we have. You wouldn't really want to make it anything else because this might become washed out, and then the dandelion with all of the little parts that are coming off might not show up as nicely if you had it muted or more in the middle ground. Moving over, you've got this very dramatic night shot. Sky is lit up with stars and kind of a purple blue. You've got the tree in the foreground here, and there's a haze going on. When you look at this image, there's only a little bit of white going on, and that's probably all that the camera's picking up right there. So everything is concentrated on the midtones and your shadows. But when you look at the image, it's a very pleasing to the eye image. It doesn't really look bad. Same idea up here. You've got shadows and the midtones and very little amount of light, but the image looks perfectly fine. Why does it look like that, or why does the histogram reflect that? You got all these deep shadows in the forest over there, and it makes it kind of hard to get through all that stuff. So, and then this guy, this is a pretty even photo, but you can see where the midtones are. It's just peaked up in the middle, and you've got a very little amount of white and then a very little amount of shadow. I would say very little shadow on this one. I am surprised that this doesn't look more like this, but if we're probably categorizing, this is probably going to be our light zone area, which would make sense because you've got a lot going on with the sky and everything else. So again, histograms are great for the beginner or for maybe even someone who wants a perfectly even shot. But if you are somebody who this isn't really what you're worried about, or you're going to continue to edit or change photos or what have you, then not focusing on the histogram, but keeping it in mind is nice, just to help you determine composition and to know how the balancing of light works across your image. Now the next thing after we've looked at our histogram, we've looked at our exposure contrast, we've looked at white balance, now we want to look at vibrancy and saturation. Most likely we have edited most of the other color on there, so now, or most of our tones, let's say. We've looked at the light and the dark parts of our image. But now we're going to look at the images that aren't necessarily just black or white. Now we're going to look at the parts of the image that have color to them. So with vibrancy, that's going to increase or decrease the color intensity and bright colors throughout the entire image. Saturation will increase or decrease color throughout the whole image evenly. So when we look at saturation, saturation is going to look at our entirety of our image. So these two will be our saturation examples. When we look at the one on the left here, everything looks fine. It looks like a traditional mountain or rolling hill landscape, maybe something that you'd get in Belgium or maybe even in Wisconsin. You get something like this, right? You get the sky there, you got kind of a nice overgoing field, colors of greens, kind of that yellowy grass area, some brown grass, and some other kind of muted brownish colors that you get throughout the background there. Well, taking that and increasing its saturation, you're going to make all those greens start to pop more. Those yellow kind of dead fields are going to become more yellow. And they're even going to lean more on the green side because naturally they are green in color. They're just yellow for it's dying or whatever the reasoning is with the grass. So now that's going to start to turn more of a yellow-green. Now you've got the sky, which is a full rainbow of different colors. Here you've got kind of a muted orange, some blues, some purples, even more blue in the corner up there, some oranges. All of that then translates even more on the other image when you increase that saturation. And you can see that it evenly increases over the entirety of the image, not just in one section or the other. So that's an important thing to remember. Saturation goes the entire image over, either increases or decreases the color throughout. Makes it more bright. Vibrancy, on the other hand, it's going to look for the color intensity in the brightest colors. So vibrancy almost plays hand in hand with your exposure and your contrast, if you will. Contrast is looking at the lighter and darker tones on the image. Exposure is kind of similar to saturation, where it's not looking at just a couple parts of the image, it's looking at the whole image. Vibrancy and your contrast are the two that are really going to kind of be similar. Vibrancy is going to look for the parts of the image that are going to be more colorful. So in this case, we look at it on the dog here, its tongue would be something more colorful. Its eyes would have more color to it. When we look at the dog, the areas where the fur starts to add more color, and you can see that the browns and the blacks aren't just one, they're going to be multitudes. That's what the camera's picking up. So this dog here almost looks like a black dog with two brown eyes and a lightly pink tongue. Maybe an older dog, you can't really tell if there's any white parts of the fur. That's vibrancy at minus 100. So that means that we've sucked the color away from this image, made it more mute. This is the original image. The eyes were brighter on this image. The tongue has more of a bubblegum pink to it. You can see the browns, even some greens, some yellows within the fur. You really see the dog's fur. And then adding those background colors too, you can see the rest of it as well. Now when we make that vibrancy even higher, on this guy, now that tongue is bright pink. Those eyes are starting to become a much more goldish color, and the blacks of his eyes actually are starting to turn more green or muted. Now the green is also feeding off the fact that there's green over here. And the way that light is reflecting, it's going to bring some of that green over to our subject. So that's why when you look at the chops of this dog, above, right here, even somewhere in the eyes and in the forehead there, you're seeing parts of green color. Now, that could be maybe the dog was running through the grass and slid a couple, I don't even know. But if I really had to take a guess on it, so that's based on the color. That's based on how the color is affecting the entire image. Another reason why when I'm talking in the intro to camera class, I say it's so important that when you're shooting your image, you don't focus on one detail. You focus on the whole composition of the image and shoot through the whole thing, because you never know what else is going to be picked up in the image. And you want to make sure that when you're editing or you're changing stuff, you, number one, always have the power to then bring the image in, crop in, and get rid of the dead space or negative space. But if you don't, the rest of your image will always educate or, what's the term I'm looking for? It will directly correlate to your subject matter. So background, foreground, that negative space, the positive space, everything matters when it's in that final cut of the image. Important to keep in mind. But vibrancy, any bright colors, any color or any area of color on there, that's something that's going to be played with vibrancy, and it's going to look for the brightest colors and play with that. Saturation, even distribution of color throughout the whole image. It's going to affect the entire saturation of color throughout the whole thing. One of the last things I like to adjust now is sharpness. So now I've gone through, I've changed my color, my composition is where I want it to be, I'm happy with everything, but now I want to play with the image's sharpness. Now, sharpness is one of the last things to do after you edit the other parts of your image. Sharpness will bring out definition and depth of field within your images. Too much will create a halo effect for the image then. So when you are playing with sharpness, it's important to remember that sharpness will make things look more crisp, if you will. And I'll use my frog for an example here. Areas like the eyeball right in the left here, when you look at that, you can see how fuzzy that line is. It's not very crisp on the background. However, when you bring it over on this side, you can see that nice white highlight. You can almost make out the texture of the skin of the frog. You really can see certain aspects of the green pop off in the bottom there. And even here, you get this nice area where you can really see the texture of that skin and the wrinkles too. Now, that being said, if you did too much of this, now you would get kind of a ring effect around the whole thing. I don't have an example of it. I couldn't find one. That one doesn't really help with the fonts. Anyway, what you're doing with sharpness is you're trying to make sure that you bring out the maybe finer details of the image. Too much of that detail and it won't look real. It'll have that kind of like almost a blurry effect around the subject matter. My best example would be to take that little dial when you get home if you're editing, jack it all the way up. It'll look clean in certain areas, and then other areas you're looking and it just won't look, it won't feel right. It'll feel like it's blurry or it's not supposed to be there, it just won't look proper. Playing with the sharpness should help clean up any parts of the image where you are losing something to the background, especially if you're a portrait or a figure-based photographer, or you have subject matters. You're not doing just like landscape or field or architectural photography. You're taking pictures of more so, let's say, this, or close-ups of maybe like flowers or insects or something like that. Playing with sharpness would be a really nice tool because you can really adjust to make sure that your subject matter isn't falling into the background and that you've got a nice little bit of a separation here. Now the last thing I talk about with the photos before we talk about some other aspects to this is what to do after that. I always recommend either printing or displaying your images of some sort. They can live on a computer, that's fine, but these are the most common frame sizes that you'll see. Depending on the camera size that you have, typically what I tell people, if you have a crop sensor camera, only stick to the top row. Reason being, once you start to blow prints up and you make things look bigger, you might lose details, it might become more blurry, it might not acquaint very well to a bigger print. So if you have an ASPC, micro four thirds, or a crop sensor camera of any kind, I would probably tell you to look at the 4.6, 5x7, 6x8, 8x8, 5x10, 8x10, or 10x12. These are very nice, common-sized images, stuff that you put on the fireplace mantle or put in your house, on the stairwell, just something to show off what you did. But let's say that you just got married, or you're on a big vacation, or you want to put up a really nice picture of your folks or your kids in the house, and you want to do a bigger print. These are great sizes, your 20x24, your movie poster print, your 16x20, 12x15, or 11x14, but you need to have a full frame camera. The reason being is that when you start to blow those images up and print those images, there's more pixels per that area. Therefore, when it gets blown up into bigger sizes, there's much more information to be printed at a larger scale. That's another reason why when you talk to painters, some people who paint are excellent at painting small little paintings. They can do an entire scene in an Altoids can. But then you ask them to do something like, let's say 16x20, and then, oh, no, they put their hands up. Because that scale, to then make it bigger, requires a different, maybe let's say tool set, or a different maybe enlargement that they can't offer. And the same goes for cameras. Crop sensor camera, it can be printed. You can print a crop sensed image up to 20 by 24, but if you were to really look at the details of the image, it might look fuzzy in certain areas or blurry in others.
Grainy.
It just
Grainy.
Grainy. That's exactly. It might look grainy. Another option that's become super popular in the last couple of years, and they've been getting really good about it, is digital picture frames. Digital picture frames are awesome. They have them where you can even just put an SD card into the frame and let all the images from your SD card run. They even have it where you can get ones that just run on an app on your phone. You can put as many photos as you want on there. They can cycle through, it can stay on an image. You can plug them anywhere in the house that you want. But it's a really nice way. I got myself one not long ago, maybe a year or so ago. It's a really nice way to show off your favorite photos. And I liked it too. There's a joke I use with selling. In the holiday times, these are one of my best sellers because it's one of those items you can buy for grandma. You can set it up in her house and you can just say, I'll put the photos on there. You don't even need to worry about it. And from your phone, you can just send all the photos you want to go right to her frame, and then she could see everything right there. So digital frame is nice because you don't have to print anything out. You pay one cost, it's there. Other ones, you pay to print every single time, and then you just have to get the frame and make sure it looks nice inside the frame. But those are the two most common ways, other than just having social media or putting them on a flash drive and never touching them. These are nice ways to display the work that you're doing and show it off to other people. Another thing too is if you print by that 4x6, a photo binder is really nice too. Throw into like a little travel binder, and then you're able to see all the images as you keep going. So I like that option too. Now the next thing to talk about, getting past our standard photography, is videography. Nowadays you've got a lot of people out there who are doing their own businesses, or they have these ideas that they want to push, but they need to basically be their own marketing team and filming team and photo team. So a lot of these cameras, and you two have Sonys, and that's a great example. Sony is probably, I would say right now, the #1 camera brand in the world. They've beat out Canon because of how they've pushed mirrorless technology, and Sony gets some of the highest regards for its video technology. Back in the day, Sony used to have a series called Handycam, and they still do make Handycams, but it was a camcorder that could shoot, unlimited video depending on what either SD card you had in there or what type of cassette you had playing in there, what have you. They moved that technology into their mirrorless cameras. So now with most of these cameras, you can shoot 4K video. Mine shoots all the way up to 8K video. I can have stability turned on, so if I have a shaky hand, the video won't show any of that stuff. And then on top of that too, I can edit this and play with this and turn it into as long or short of a video as I want, put it on things like Facebook or my website or other social medias, and I can do whatever I want with it. So within filming, there's a couple things that you should know, and one of the things I like to talk about is phrases, because I think phrasing and how we do things, or phases of production, are important. So there's pre-production, production, and post-production. Pre are the initial steps to beginning to making your project. In pre-production, this might be where you start writing down where you're going to take photos or videos at, how you want to do it, maybe the scene by scene for what you want to do. I want to record, maybe my garden. How do I go about this? How do I make it look interesting? Okay, well, I want to do a close-up on this one pepper plant that I have, and then I want to pan and walk through my whole garden to show that off. Those are things that you would talk about in your pre-production steps to make sure you educate yourself. You know what you're doing. In production, that's the main phase of capturing all these clips and or film for use. Now this is where you're taking everything you talked about in pre and you're doing all the work. Now you're going through, you're filming everything, you're taking your photos, you're doing your videos, you're getting the meat and potatoes done. So then when you're done with your production, you can now go to post. Post-production is where you put it all together and you make that final piece. Whether you use those photo editors or video editors that we were just talking about, or if you just use the free stuff that's on your computer already, you're doing what's called post-production. You're taking your final project, putting it together based on everything that you got from your production side of things. From there though, unlike photos, where when we're looking at still photography, it just kind of comes down to, okay, if I'm getting this camera, it says it shoots at full frame at 61 megapixels, That means I'm going to get a really sharp image. Video acquaints a little bit differently, and this is where it starts to get very complicated, and I don't mean complicated in a bad way, but this is where a lot of thought process can come in. So video resolution, we'll start there. Right now, 4 types of video resolution. This applies for TVs too, so we'll say it's a double education. Standard definition, HD, 4K, 8K. What does all that mean? When you take your math, if you do math, there are pixels on your camera or on your TV screen, computer screen. There are pixels going this direction, and then pixels going this direction, and then there are rows of those going down on each section. So what they do is they take the number of pixels going this way and multiply it by the number of pixels going this way. They then divide that whole TV from the corner to corner, or your image from corner to corner, and that's how they then get how many pixels are within the whole thing. So there are 7,080 going that way, 4,300 going that way. When you multiply those together and divide, 8K. Same thing, 4K. Full HD, that's 1080. Standard definition is 720. So when you're shooting a video, you're shooting them with those remarks. Now, the same way of when you're taking a photo and you've got a crop sensor camera and a full frame camera, that size then changes based on that. So you can play a standard definition video as big as you want, but the second you start to make that video look bigger, it's going to look more pixelated, more blurry, not as clean. And it gets better and better as you keep moving up. So choosing the quality of your video matters based on who you're trying to show this to. What I say all the time is, like, if I'm taking a video for, let's say, Instagram, or my friends want to put this on Facebook or social media, HD is going to be more than enough for them. And the only reason being is because so many people that are viewing this might be viewing on their phone, might be viewing on a computer screen at home, something that doesn't necessarily get rated for 8K or 4K quality. HD is just fine. Let's say I want to put together a short film, maybe a project that's like 4 or 5 minutes in length, and I want to not only show it on maybe social media, but I'd like to put it on the TV, and I'd like to maybe really give a show to some people. 4K would be perfect for that. 4K, now you're getting into the higher resolution, you're getting really nice details. If you want to put that video on a 65-inch or 75-inch TV, it's going to look nice. 8K video, you can do that as well too. Honestly, really the only times you're going to see 8K nowadays are for like video games, almost all video games. If you play on certain systems and you go move over to a really spanking fancy TV, 8K video, you'll notice every little thing in the game. It's pretty cool. But here's the other way you can look at it. For people that don't pay a premium for Comcast, you're most likely watching on standard definition. For those that have the HD channels on there, you're watching HD. For those that are watching on Netflix, Hulu, Disney Plus, and they've got maybe a TV within the last 4 or 5 years, 4K. Anything after that, it's really not existing right now as far as TV goes. So 8K, not to worry about, but we are getting there. And that's why you're going to see these cameras continue to get that. Now, the ratios is a little bit different. But the way that I can describe this is by sensor size. On your camera, if you take that lens off, you've got that multicolored rainbow little square on there, and that's your image sensor. That is what's basically taking the information that cuts through the lens, and then when it gets through the lens, it's hitting your sensor, reading everything, and then computing it back to the screen or to your viewfinder so you can see what you're getting. If anybody's going to go see that Oppenheimer movie, you're going to notice that the screen itself is going to look a little bit different because of how he shot it. He shot it, if I'm not mistaken, on a 4/3 aspect ratio. So what that basically means is that he shot it in a way, Christopher Nolan, that the film would look like the same type of film they would have used in 1945 when the bomb went off, and the nuke went off. That's the idea behind the ratios, is that the ratio can bring in and change your field of view. So if, let's say you've got this 8K in the corner, you bring it down to that 16:9, you might lose or cut that off so that you don't see it. That's going to then put black bars on your TV or on the video that you're then recording, but by doing that, you could capture something a little bit different. That's more of a stylistic choice. There's really no other reasoning behind that, I would say. It's more for you to just kind of get something to look cool. Now, flipping over to FPS, or frames per second, this is important. My example for this, most movies, TV shows, everything that you watch shoots in 24 frames a second. That's pretty much a universal standard. All your cameras shoot in 24 frames a second. That's pretty standard too. 12 frames, basically going to be less information. That's where you start to see chippy choppy stuff when you're watching it. 60 frames per second gets you more into that slow-mo category, and 120 frames in a second gets you more to that hyperlapse or time-lapse videos, where you can basically let your camera run for like 30-40 minutes and you can watch an entire like sunset or anything like that. So the frame rates matter, but depending on what you're doing, most people can get away with 24. If you want to do some slow-mo stuff, maybe the kids or the family are going to run into the lake or the beach and you're like, oh, I want to get a fun video, then maybe bring it down to 60 or 120 and you can play it back in slow motion, and it might be really cool. But you can play with that. And what frames per second means, it's one individual frame. It's like taking one individual photo. And so basically what they're doing, and what a video is for the most part, it's a stack of images. And it's just that in every image, something moves ever so slightly, and we get a moving picture when they're played really fast. It's like when you take a, what am I thinking of? Those books where you just take your finger and you just go like that and the pages would spin up and you'd get like a little scene out of there. That's the exact same thing that you're getting on this, except you're getting it on a video or a film format. So when we look at video, it's important to think about resolution, the ratio if you're trying to be artistic or have some sort of creative feel for it, or then you're thinking of your frames per second. Some way for the video then to play where then you're getting the proper type of playback and reception without having chippy choppy movements, or if you do want chippy choppy movements, you're doing that with purpose or with thought. Alright, so must-haves within there. When filming, making any kind of content, you should be focusing on 3 things initially. When I first started making videos and even doing this class, my marketing team and our advertisement team sat me down and they said, you can have one thing bad, but you can't have all 3. Because if you have all 3, no one will watch. I was like, okay, good to know. You can have bad camera quality, but if your lighting and your audio is great, you're good. You can have bad lighting and have really good camera quality and good audio. It is fine. You can have bad audio, you just better have good lighting and good camera quality. If you have 2 of those bad and only 1 is good, nobody cares. If you have all 3 bad, nobody really cares. So it's important that you're focusing on these. So for example, we've got a little camera on this laptop that I use to live stream. It's a garbage camera. So I went and we bought this little 1080 video camera, which plays a little bit of a better video. So if I flip over, let's see, let me get the webcam. I'm in full HD right now. That's what everybody can see me at. Now if I went back to the camera on the physical computer, that would be in standard definition. That one, I would maybe look a little bit more pixelated. You would see the light behind me would flare out a little bit more. It just wouldn't look proper. Now if I had a 4K camera on this, I would be even sharper in detail. The lighting behind me would feel more muted and back because the camera would have more to pick up that's in the foreground and in the front. It would necessarily have more pixels going throughout the whole thing, so the video quality would just go higher. And so would everything that you see within there. So when we look at that, camera quality. Having a camera that shoots appropriately for the content you're trying to make doesn't have to be movie pro quality, but it has to work for you and your project or your page. I've got people in my life that are making their own brand. They make clothes, they're doing well with it. The way that they market is they have a 2001 camera that they got from their mom, and they use only that. The images look terrible. It's like an 8 megapixel camera, but the way that they show off their brand, it works. That's how they sell themselves. They sell it to look a little more vintage. Lighting. When you're using lighting, and this goes for photos as well too, you should have a 3-step lighting process. So there's a key light that provides light directly onto your subject. The fill light is your second light that fills in the light on the subject when the key couldn't. And then you have a backlight, which keeps the subject and background separate. I have an example of that on the next page. And then audio quality, mics. You should be having some sort of mics to look at. You've got a shotgun mic, you've got the camera mic, that's going to be the one that's already built into your camera or device, and then you have wireless mics like lav mics as well too. Those are all great resources. These are my examples of lighting. Now, the best type of lighting you could ever have is the sunlight. It's the natural light. It's powerful. There's a lot of information there, and you can do a lot to deflect and remove and play with that. Now, for the average photographer, that's a lot of work. You don't necessarily need to do that. That's where your camera, with all its advanced settings, ISO, and exposure compensation, can help. But when you're in a studio, where, we've been talking about it for weeks, the can lighting that we have in this room isn't really optimal for the best photos. So in that case, you'd be looking at something like this for a professional studio setup. It doesn't have to be as big or as bulky. These are probably examples of a $5,000 to $6,000 light setup. But I bought for myself, because I sell cards on eBay. That's one of my other pastimes that I do here. I inherited a baseball card collection. But when I'm selling these cards, I have to photograph them in a way so that people can see all the imperfections, the creases, the corners, everything. So when I'm shooting, my card sits kind of positioned on like a little stand, if you will. I have light coming from the top of the card to fill in so that everything gets saturated. That's my key light. That's doing all the work for me. But now I've got this key light that's hitting the card, and there's some reflection on the card, some shine to it. I need to get rid of that shine. So I want to bring in a fill light. That's going to, number one, help reduce that key light, but then it's also going to help me bring more light in so I have more to read. But now I've got a harsh background on my subject matter because I've got two lights on its front and nothing behind it. That's where then my background light comes in. My background light isn't touching my card at all. It's actually taking the light all in the back of the card, but that's helping me get rid of any unwanted shadows. So in the case of the subject matter of the girl that we have standing here, the only shadow you get is under her right armpit, and a little bit on her hip as her arm comes down, but you don't get the harsh shadows that you would if, let's say, this backlight was gone, and now you would only have light hitting her from the one side, giving her this kind of ugly shadow going down half of her face. That could be something that you want artistically, but if you're trying in a studio or in a home environment to get a shot with as much lighting as possible to kind of falsify that sun, this is the type of lighting you should be looking at. Alternative lighting. So on-camera flashes are great. Videography, not so much, but for still photography, I definitely would recommend them. Now, again, with you gentlemen, since you're my examples, you both have Sony cameras. The Sony camera's ISO is jacked through the roof. Do you necessarily need a flash for everything? No. But a flash could come into handy in certain situations. One of my friends does a lot of food photography right now for companies where he actually shoots pictures for their menus, not just for Instagram or whatever, but like a company wants to set up their restaurant, they need help getting pictures of the food for their menu or for their online ordering portal. He comes in, they prepare the dishes, he then sets up and takes pictures. 9 out of 10 times, doesn't matter how much light is coming in, he always has a flash on his camera. The reason being is the more light he can put on the image, the more he can bring that light down in the editing software, and he can control more of it when there's more light on the subject matter than if there's less light on the subject matter and he's got to go in after. On-camera LED lights or light blocks. So ProMaster makes a lot of these, other brands make a lot of these. They're really helpful. Typically they recharge via cable, and the cool part with those lights is that you can change them. They can do RGB colors, so you can get a red, a yellow, a blue, a green on your subject matter, or you can change the Kelvin tone. So you can do a warm or a light Kelvin, or a warm or a cold Kelvin. Warm Kelvin will be a higher number, and that's typically going to be more of an orangey light. That means more life. I would say like these are an example of warm Kelvin lights. Example like Edison bulbs, where you can see the inside coil and everything. That's going to be more warm. When you look at, like, let's say an LED light, or like during the holiday times when people put lights on for the Christmas trees, they'll have this cold, stark white light on their trees. that's going to be a colder Kelvin light. And typically with those lights you can change mood, but you can also change your human or subject matter up to make them look, I would say, more alive or more dead. It's the best way to put that. And then ring lights is another great example. Ring lights are really nice because they put light everywhere on the subject matter, but they do it in a form of a 360 circle. The best way to describe that are people who want to do content creation or really want to do more vlogging at home. But anybody who wants studio lighting, these are a really nice, cheap way of bringing light onto the subject matter without necessarily needing those giant lights with the reflecting sheets and everything else. So I do like ring lights. Microphone examples. On-camera mic, like I said, if you look at your camera, you should have some dots somewhere on there, some holes. That's your microphone. Typically, the in-camera mic is trash. It's not a very good microphone. It's like the TV speakers on your TV. Typically, they're not good. Same can be said with this, because with the microphone, you have to be particular, right? With microphones, they're trying to pick up the audio from what you're trying to record. With these mics, they are more wide open, so they're going to play out in a multitude of directions. You're going to get everything coming into the camera at once. When you use something like a shotgun mic, it's important to remember that even though the shape is pointed possibly at the subject matter that you're doing this with, that you're also at the very end still going to get a fanning out of the sound. So the idea is that it's pointed towards you, it's not towards me. So if I'm behind the mic and I'm like chatting, you shouldn't hear it, or if you do, it's very, very small. You're primarily going to hear the target that you're pointing this at. However, wherever your target is, if you have things happening on the right and left side of that, it'll also get picked up. So as great as these are, they still have their flaws. That's where a wireless mic might come into play. DJI, Rode, Ceramic, they all make a different version of it. They connect to your camera, they give you a receiver, and then typically they give you microphones that either have a clip so you can clip them onto your collar, or if you really want to get fancy with it, you don't want it seen at all, people will hook them on their belt, and then they get lav mics. And this is where you see movie stars and talk show hosts do. If you ever see somebody kind of get up and they have to pull these contraptions off their back and stuff, that's what they're pulling off. They're pulling off the receiver for their microphone. The lav mic can then go through, and typically it'll get hidden on the collar and you don't really see it, and if you do, it's very minor. And the last thing is a boom mic. We don't sell any of those in the store. I don't typically recommend them often, but when you have situations where these three don't work, this is going to be the only other option that you have to get audio. Boom mic, it's going to be just like the cartoons or just like the movie show. Some person's going to have to sit there and hold the microphone above their head and just kind of make sure they don't bop them on accident and keep it out of frame. But where this mic points out to whatever the subject matter is and then captures things around it as well too, this is the same exact thing, but now you're changing the angle. So now you have it above the person, and now it's only capturing basically like an umbrella of where they're at. So as they're talking, that sound's going to get picked up from the microphone, and the microphone should really only capture what it's above. So it's a nice option to have. It's a nice option to look into if those other three options don't work out for you. The last thing we'll talk about is stabilizing your shot. Tripods. So you're talking about those. Multitude of different tripods you can get. A monopod is going to be a single-legged tripod. And I like the monopod specifically for hiking, nature, or trail-based activities. Reason being is that most people will take their monopod and turn it into a walking stick. So it becomes a dual-purpose object at this point. I have a lot of customers that talk about walking with walking sticks or the retractable kind of ski sticks. This would almost become that same thing. Most of these guys will have two different options. They're going to always usually give you some form of handle or straps. You can put it around your wrist, or you can loop it around your belt in the back if you need to as well. But the bottom point, some are going to have just a singular rubber bottom stopper that will basically be able to lock into some rocks or into dirt or into water, whatever you need. The other one is going to open up in almost a triangle form. It's going to have three legs to it and go down. Some of them will even have a rotational ball head on the bottom, and the brand man Frodo that I have up there makes such a one too. A little bit more pricey, but if you want the most stability with a monopod, typically getting the one that opens up with the 3 feet on the bottom, that's the best. More expensive, a little heavier because they're using more metal on the product, but it's a nice thing if you are having some issues. Now, it's only as stable as you are stable. So if you're still shaky, this is going to be nice to prevent you from kind of bobbing up and down like this, but it might not be as nice for bobbing back and forth side to side. So that is sometimes a problem with the monopod. That's when we move into tripods. Tripods are more for still photo, and specifically it's a ball head tripod that's made for photo. Ball head usually has a rotational head. It's a ball and socket joint. There's a clip on the top with a 1/4-20 thread. By the way, if you flip your cameras upside down, you look at the bottom, that hole on the bottom is a 1/4 inch. So for that, it's a standard size. Every camera, almost known to man, would be that size. I can't think of a camera that's not. Maybe a GoPro. GoPros have a little bit of a different type of setup than these guys, but if you set the GoPro up properly, you would then be able to put it on one of these if you want. But ball-headed joints, typically they'll have a notch on the side, so you can actually turn the camera and get a vertical or horizontal picture depending if you want landscape or if you want a hamburger or hot dog style. The other thing that you get with that is 3 legs that come out, all with adjustable sizes and heights, including the center neck of the tripod also having an adjustable height. The benefit to this now is that where the monopod gives you the shakiness kind of going back and forth, this one gives you no shakiness at all. And it even gives you the ability to adjust the legs. So let's say you are at like a mountain or something and you've got one rock that comes up to here and everything else is lower. You can make one of these legs really short and then make the other 2 really long to fit into the space. But for someone who's trying to get maybe long exposure or landscape-oriented photos or heavily detailed wide shots, this is a great way to go about it. It does require you bringing around more gear, but in the long run of things, it's easier to use than a monopod, or not easier to use, but it'll give you more stability than a monopod will. Monopod will weigh less, cost a little bit less, but your regular tripod will have more stability, just more weight. So it's important to keep those 2 in mind. Last one is the video tripod, which goes more into the video aspect that we've been talking about. Cool thing with a video tripod is it's typically got what you call a panning or fully rotational head. So typically with that head you can go up and down, but then you can also rotate from side to side. So you can get the fluid movements that you'd want to get when you're filming. Now the other thing that a lot of video tripods have, and this one doesn't, some of them will have wheels. And that's really nice. I've seen a lot of weddings, or I've been to a lot of weddings I should say, where the bride and the groom will hire a videographer and they'll actually come out with a tripod like this, but with wheels on the bottom. And they're able to like physically walk around and film without having to lift the camera up and down, without giving it any shaky quality. They really are able to get a clean video as long as they have a smooth floor, or smooth surface. So again, video tripods, where they differ from your ball head tripod, is that the video tripod has more of a pan, tilt, and roll feature that a gimbal would have, more things that are associated with the smoothness of video rather than the stability of a photo. In that same vein though is gimbals. So when your video tripod, let's say, you got the one with the wheel and you're going, now you see all these bumps and you're like, I can't really do that. This is where then you kind of fall into place. Traditionally speaking, the only one that you're going to mainly see is this guy. The single-handed gimbal. They can even give you an attachment to do 2 hands on there so you get even more stability, but that's awesome for video. I had a customer earlier who asked why she'd want to use one of these, and the short and simple answer is that when you're taking a video with your hand, you might start to notice how choppy and bumpy it starts to get. That's where you're going to need something like this. That's going to reduce that, and if let's say you have to really step out of the way and make a crazy movement, the camera's gimbal weight shifts with you, so that way it doesn't move or doesn't appear to come off balance or off axis. So that's where the gimbal comes into play. Let's say that you've got a large video camera You just got a job with Paramount Pictures. There is where now you might start using the two-handed gimbal. I have a few friends that have one of these things, and I think it's the most obnoxious thing in the world. But some people need it. They do need it. Thing with a two-handed gimbal is that typically you're going to have somebody else controlling your camera. Your main job is to literally hold the thing and walk through the space. Typically you have a monitor on your back, and someone's actually then able to monitor your video and make the adjustments so the camera can pan, turn, or do whatever else that it needs to do. Other times people will be watching the screen with their two-handed, and they're able to go up, go down, turn from side to side. But now that you've got both hands in use, it does make it harder to use the controls that you would have somewhere here. So a lot of these gimbals, just for common knowledge, will have some controls here, maybe some controls there. But a lot of two-handed gimbals are going to give a screen or a monitor that then the other person, someone else gets to use, so it's a two-person job. And the last thing is a body gimbal or stabilizer vest. If you ever have to get one of these, please bring it in. I'd like to see it. They look really cool. My only time I've ever seen someone use this, I had a good friend of mine who was doing a documentary. He had a $75,000 camera that he was using to shoot with. It's a Sony camera. It was gorgeous. Thing weighed about 70, 80 pounds. He had to wear one of these for an event that he had to shoot with that camera with this documentary. So they were doing a party scene. So he wore that gimbal. He had a couple drinks in him, and the video that he has is the $75,000 camera on the thing. He's got the whole contraption. He just lets go. Camera, boom, boom, bounces right back up. Doesn't hit the ground. It just it goes down a little bit and then bounces right back up. And he doesn't move. The gimbal has all the weight and everything else in there, and everything that it counterbalances that, so it doesn't kill his back. So again, it becomes more complicated. Do you need this? No. I would probably say no. Majority of people don't need those two items. But if you do, you're really doing it so that you get the most stable video. You've got a heavy set of gear, and you need more control and more stability over it so that you can get the right shot. We don't sell either of those two-handed gimbals or stabilizer vests here in the store. So that should tell you how many people actually use it. Last thing we'll talk about real quick, setting up that gimbal. When you start using a gimbal, there's various configurations of both camera bodies and lenses that you're going to require you to stabilize it every time. If you use, let's say, your Sony right now, and you put that 50mm lens on there with a gimbal, and you're like, this is great, I need to change it up, and throw my 70 to 24, my 24 to 70 on there, you're going to have to recalibrate the whole gimbal, because now you're changing the weight. Another thing I just had today, a woman called in, and she wanted to use a microphone with her gimbal, and she asked, what's the process for doing that? And I was like, it works, there's no issue. But now you're adding more weight to a gimbal that's only geared to work for so much weight. So now you got to add counterweights. Well, as soon as I told her that, she was immediately like, I don't want to do this. And I'm like, it's not that complicated, but you have to be thinking about this kind of stuff. Otherwise, the video is just going to keep, your gimbal's not going to stay straight. It'll just keep flopping over. So when you're shooting and when you're doing this kind of stuff, you need to reconfigure it multiple times. And it's going to be a pain. But the main three things that you're changing are your pan, which is your ability to go up and down, your tilt, which is going to be your ability to tilt, and then your roll, which is basically going to feel like a pan, but it almost rolls like this, and if you were to flip the whole thing upside down, you could. So there's the pan, your tilt, and your roll. The other thing that I could say when you're using a gimbal, and the only other thing to really think about, is just use fluid motions and practice everything out prior to shooting. So when you're shooting on a gimbal, don't just kind of like sit there and do this. It looks harsh on the camera. It doesn't look fun. I mean, maybe you found some creative use for it. But when you're doing stuff on the gimbal, the last time I shot on a gimbal, I remember we had this scene where my friend was going to walk from door to door. And I wanted to just get the feet and show like this thing. We were going to do some sound effect over it to make it sound like they were walking in a hurry. So what we did was we started with where you could see the door open and you could see the legs come out, and then we panned down and followed them real low as they walked through. But it was a fluid motion. We didn't just kind of like chippy chop with it. We used it from our shoulder, and that's the other recommendation that I would give. Depending on the weight that you have, try to use the shoulder, use the main point, try to avoid using elbows or your wrist, because then that's when it's up hurting after a period of time. Obviously, if you have shoulder problems or anything else, as goofy as it might sound, a body gimbal or stabilizer vest might be the next option. But as far as using a gimbal, it's really can become complex and complicated when you start to set it up. But once you start playing with the motions and the actual use of it, it all kind of starts to flow together, and it'll make more sense. And that is all I have for you today. So next week we have Beyond the Traditional Camera. So next week we're focusing in on the actual like GoPros and drones, camcorders, anything that's not a regular camera, but that you can add to either make your video project or take your photos, all that sort of stuff. I love the drone. That's my personal favorite one out of the bunch. I use it for family photos, actually, my drone. What I do is if we have a group, or we have a family, maybe about 15 people, every couple of years we like to meet up, I'll fly the drone in front of us and I'll position the camera just at like eye level so that it takes a whole group shot of everybody, but nobody has to be behind the camera. Nobody's got to sit there and do that. We don't have to set it up on a tripod and hit the timer button and run over. We set the drone, I put the controller behind my back, everyone smiles, and I hit the trigger, and now everyone's got a beautiful photo to show. So there are really cool uses for them other than just pretending that they're toys, so we'll go over that next week. But yeah, thanks for being here, guys. What kind of questions do you have for me?
I got a bunch.
Go for it. Go ahead. We got 10 minutes. If anybody online has any questions, by all means, chime in and ask. I'll leave it open for a little bit longer. If nobody online has any questions, I'll close it off in about 10 minutes.
If I'm shooting a landscape, do I want to use is the AFF focus better than the AFC focus?
So one focus is going to be for just a single AFS or AFC, correct?
AFC would be continuous,
Yes,
right?
and then
I mean,
AFS is single.
yeah.
So I like continuous. Continuous uses more of the battery up, but continuous is basically saying that if something's moving in the subject, it's going to continuously keep autofocusing. I personally would keep it on AFC. Maybe the reason I'd want to turn it on autofocus for single shot would be if I am doing landscape, I don't necessarily have a lot moving, and if I plan on shooting for, let's say, a multitude of hours, maybe longer than I would normally, then I might want to do that so that it saves and conserves on my battery life, but then also I don't really have the subject matter in front of me moving as frequently. So that's a personal choice, I would say, but it's all dependent on what your battery would be like.
So this Sony has a creative style mode, and there's a couple things in there. There's portrait and landscape, sunset, vivid, black and white, whatever. So
Think about that as like, so back in the day with these DSLR and mirrorless cameras, they used to have what they called scenes. Scenes was the same exact thing. It's automatic on the camera, but now you're letting your camera become more specialized towards one thing or the other. Your auto on the camera automatically does all that stuff for you.
it does. So I guess the question is, am I going to get a better picture if I go to program mode, the function button, and zero in on portrait, landscape, whatever, versus the automatic?
You might, but you might get, you might get a better image. My experience, you don't.
Okay.
But I also haven't experienced that on the Sony myself. I'm thinking of the old Canon and Nikon system when you would do that. It just didn't look nice. It would basically do the same thing as auto, but at the same time, if I wanted to get a cleaner shot, I would move more towards my manual priorities and see if I could then control it by myself.
Is there, and maybe this is probably not the advanced class question, how do I do exposure bracketing? Is there a mode that I go to on this?
Exposure bracketing. What do you want to see?
Well, I want to take like get an image. I want to bracket. I want to do an exposure bracket and get, change the f-stop or the speed or whatever, so that I ended up with 3 quick pictures and they're all slightly different with exposure, so that I can, I can pick the best one.
I think what you're going to want to do. Oh man, and then you asked me a question, and
I've got it written down, I won't bring it up.
I'm gonna have it, I swear, I didn't, oh man.
I won't bring it up. And we can talk about this another time.
No,
too.
you're okay, no.
I don't know where you go to, you know what I'm talking
I
about?
know what you're talking about, yeah, so you're basically talking about taking multitudes, like let's say 3 images, but then ever so slightly having where like either the f-stop changes or the
Yes.
shutter would
Yes.
change. There is a way to do it. Here, as soon as I end that video, I'll Google it real quick for you.
Okay,
'Cause I'm gonna find
we
out.
can work on that later. It seems like memory cards can go bad. It's probably a good idea to have another memory card. Does it make sense to, if you're going on, you're taking a lot of pictures, rather than have a whole slug of pictures on one memory card, to maybe change out your memory cards and have, 20 pictures on this, 20 pictures, I don't know.
You can, that's all preference. That one I can't really say too much. You sure?
I have to go.
Oh, okay, I understand.
That's
If you have any questions, please just call or
I
email
took
me.
a picture of that.
Yeah, I'll be here. I got you anytime.
Yeah. And I'll see you next week.
Next week, yeah, it'll be drones next week. So if you
I
want
saw
the
that.
advanced one,
I'm gonna
yeah.
bring my son, he does a lot of pictures.
Oh, there you go.
I love it.
But, 2 weeks from today.
And then I'll have intro, exactly. So then the beginning of August will be my intro to photography, and then we'll pick them right back up from the beginning.
Okay.
So I'll see you there.
Good to meet you.
Good to meet you as well.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for coming in.
Thank you.
It depends on you. So I personally only bring maybe, I have like a little container full of SD cards. I have about 8 SD cards when I go out. I like to have a lot of them just in case I experience one going bad
Sure.
and it doesn't work, so I have the extra. However, when I'm shooting, for example, I was on my week-long cruise, I used the same SD card for the entirety of the cruise. Nothing happened with that SD card. By the end of it, I had 8,000 photos. All 8,000 plugged into the computer, downloaded them all. It took
How long
forever.
did it take? A day?
Less than that, maybe 4 hours, I think is what I think
Okay.
said.
Okay.
About 4 hours. So it really, it's all up to you on that stuff. I don't like to do it because then if my mind is, okay, if I forgot that those photos were on that SD card after I did all my switching, now randomly somewhere in one of those SD cards I've got photos I can't find, and maybe I'll forget one day and then I'll try to format the card and I'll erase everything on accident. So I don't do it for confusion purposes, just to not confuse myself, to not mix
But you
myself
bring
up.
an extra one in case there's a malfunction?
Yes,
Okay.
always have an extra one just in case.
All right, that's good to know. The, this workshop that I'm going to in October, the guy is telling me to bring my camera, but also the laptop. But, and I haven't said, why do I need the laptop?
Probably to go through and to edit photos and to work on your either photo editing aspect of it, if that's something that's a part of the workshop. If it's not,
I don't think it is, but
could be just storage. Could be the way that you're storing these, naming your files and doing stuff. The other gentleman who was here last week, Bill, that was one of his major questions that he had for me, was how to store and properly alphabetize and catalog all of the stuff that you just did. And he asked me what my 2 cents about that were, and I gave. Every photographer has a different way that they go about it. So everybody will, some people go, like for me personally, when I go through my folder section of my hard drive, I have, for my photos, everything labeled by year. When I break and I click into that, I have everything then labeled by month. And when I click on that month, I have everything labeled by event or by whatever it is. And then from there, I can go through and find. So I have my organizational tools so that way I know where basically any of my photos are at any time. That most likely could be the reason why they want you to bring it. Could be that photo storage part of it. How are you storing your photos? How are you categorizing these so you know how to look through them? Also, how are you viewing them on the computer to determine whether or not it was a good image or a bad image? If there's no editing aspect to the workshop, that's the only other thing I could think
so
of.
yeah, right now I do a trip and I put them on that, make a trip name.
Yep.
But I wasn't sure if, so, it's a class, workshop, everyone's gonna be taking pictures.
Yeah.
I'm sure in the evenings, he's gonna wanna go, okay, something like, everyone give me your memory card. will he probably put it into like his computer and then project it or whatever, or show
You
it?
could, yeah. I mean, he also might just have you. The other thing too is like again, when you look at that the camera, you have a 3-inch LCD screen right there. It's a very small screen to see all the detail. That's the secondary reason for having the bigger screen with you there, so you can actually see the finer detail of your camera. You got a camera that shoots with 40-something megapixels right now. You want to see all of those little details. You're not going to see it on the screen. Even when you hit that zoom button to see the clarity of all your image, that's fine to, like for you. But nothing is until you have it on a bigger screen where you can enlarge and see that stuff. So
When I put the memory chip into the computer, it takes a long time to download the pictures.
Yep.
But then when I go, okay, let's go to the file, I want to look at the pictures.
it's
It
quick.
seems like, they show them one at a time, but the picture will come up and then it'll take 5 seconds for the focus to come in. Is that normal?
I'd have to see an example of it. I mean, that could.
I don't know if I got it set up right, and I don't know if I next time should bring my laptop.
Bring your laptop with you next time so I could see that. Bring
Right,
it.
because I'm just,
Yeah.
maybe I'm doing something wrong. I just
You
like,
I doubt it. Maybe it's just something that I'm not. Maybe it's a setting that's on. But typically, when I shoot, every once in a while, I do notice that where I'll put a photo on the computer. It takes a second. All of a sudden, it goes from like kind of pixely to then
Yeah.
full focus.
Yeah.
That just might be your computer loading.
Maybe it's the computer that,
How old is the
I
computer?
don't know.
Any guesstimate on that age of that computer?
It's probably 5 years old,
That shouldn't be that big of a.
and it's a computer that it's got a touch screen ability.
Yeah, no, that shouldn't be anything then.
Um,
No, I mean, it could just take a little bit to load. Again, the hard thing right now, too, is that you have a camera that is, I would say, 2 times more powerful than the standard camera. And it's 5 times more powerful than your iPhone. So the thing I think that you'd be running into is the fact that your camera is basically buff and jacked, and your computer or everything else might just be a little bit slower.
So my
That could
computer, if I brought it in, do you have Wi-Fi here or something?
Yeah, we got Wi-Fi here.
We can plug it in and get Wi-Fi.
Yeah, but you got internet here, but yeah, but with the camera stuff, you don't really need it. Yeah.
Let's see,
Yeah, while you ask that question, let me end this guy. Guys, thanks for being on tonight. Appreciate everybody. Have a great night. If you need anything from me, call or email me. You've got my contact information there. But then I will be back on next Thursday for another camera class. We'll be doing Beyond the Traditional Camera class the last Thursday of the month, and then we'll bring it back to intro.